First of all, I want to say good afternoon. Thank you for your patience as we got these technical difficulties sorted out. Not totally, because my machine doesn't want to hide the sidebar. No, there you go. Okay, so the name of my presentation obviously is Role Model What for Whom. And what I want to begin by saying is my title does say, can non-peer supervisors effectively supervise peer support workers? And I did that intentionally because I wanted to be a little provocative. It's also based on research that I have done. But my disclaimer, first and foremost, is this is not meant as a criticism of non-peer supervisors at all. But I wanted to give all of us today an opportunity to gain perspective on what I think is just something of great interest to all of us who are involved in peer support work, peer support supervision. This slide, my daughter would say, duh, what is supervision? But it's an important question. And the reason I lead with it is because throughout the course of my research, I did tremendous amount of literature review, trying to answer this question, which seemed so simple. You know, most of us have been supervised at one point or another in our life, either willingly or unwillingly. So what is supervision? And what I've discovered from looking at the literature is there's a lot written about it, but there's really no consensus. The closest we can get to consensus about supervision is what you do in supervision depends on your goals. Well, what does that mean? It means that for the most part, there are three widely accepted goals for supervisors: administrative, supportive, educational. Later on today, you'll hear from my colleagues, Jonathan Edwards and Gita Enders, who have, fortunately for all of us, added to these goals. But for now, in most of supervision land, these are what is meant when you talk about supervision. So clearly, if the goal is administrative, the supervisor wants to talk to you about your time, are you getting your job done, your attendance oversight, and basically it's a quality assurance function. Are you following the policies, the rules and regulations of the place where you're working? If the goal is supportive, however, the supervisor is really working with an employee to improve their performance, to increase coping skills, prevent stress and burnout. And I will share with you, when you look at the literature, this is the part of supervision that has the most evidence in research. Supervision can and frequently does prevent burnout and loss of job retention. So, yeah, good to know, right? But this is where I'm going. If the goal is educational, what is understood by that is the supervisor uses demonstration and role modeling, discussion and feedback, and practice to support learning new skills. So that's interesting, isn't it? Because it makes sense when there is a joint understanding about the basis of supervision. And what most of the literature and most practitioners understand about supervision is that it's stratified within a professional practice domain. What do I mean by that? It means if you are a social worker, you supervise social workers. If you're a nurse, you supervise nurses, yada, yada, yada. And it's based on the idea that the supervisor has more education, more experience, and expertise. That's why they're supervising you, to help you learn the skills that come with you in your particular practice domain. So I got very interested in this when the Medicaid regulations came out in 2007. And as probably all of you know by now, one of the pieces of guidance is that peer support supervisors required to be licensed as mental health workers. Now, they didn't define what that meant, but for most states, as you all know, that was interpreted as someone with a license. And for the most part, back then, it was non-peers. And I found that fascinating, and it was really the basis of my research, trying to understand, how does that work? Because supervision is really important. And all the literature, everything that you read and everything that you experience tells us that supervision can be a very important source of skill development, but more importantly, as a way of addressing the challenges a peer support worker may encounter while attempting to be included into multidisciplinary work settings. And I put this slide up just to say to you, when I went looking for literature on supervision for peer support workers, most of the literature, outside of the gray literature, which is the kind of practical hands-on stuff that we all searched for initially, but most of the literature really talked about the challenges that peer support workers were having as they attempted to get included or integrated, not my favorite word, integrated, but included in already existing systems of care. I'm not going to read all of this. I really put it up as a visual to say there's a lot of challenges that folks have experienced, are experiencing, will experience. Reminder to all of us, even though self-help and peer support has been around a very, very long time, the idea of including it in regular systems of care, mental health systems of care, is relatively new. By relatively, I knew it's only 20 years. Nothing, nada, a little blip in time. So we're all in this arena as it transitions from a system that could be exclusionary to one that is more inclusive, and from a system that was based on a medical model of care, kind of an expert, I'm the expert, I tell you what to do, you just do it, you'll be fine, model of care, to one that understands that recovery is a journey that is the responsibility of the person embarking on it, with help from those around them who care about them and who want them to succeed. So I'm talking about this in some depth because this is the crux of the matter. And this is why I want to have this discussion about perspective, because the lens you use is what you see through, right? So for non-peer supervisors, they understand supervision in the context of clinical supervision. That's how it's understood in behavioral health services. That's how folks who are licensed are trained. That's what they experience. And what that means is that supervision is typically provided by a senior member of the profession to someone who's less senior who doesn't have the experience and who is learning the skills of that profession. So supervisors who have been brought up, if you will, as clinical supervisors, what they know is their practice, their clinical practice, how they understand the world and how they interpret what they see is through that lens. And what I wanted to highlight today, because I think it's important for all of us who believe so firmly in peer support and recovery and all of that that goes with it, is that not everyone understands and not everyone sees it the same way. You know, and I know, that there are differences between the practice of a licensed clinician and the practice of a peer support worker. The research I did, which I presented at this conference a couple of years ago, was to really go around the country and ask peer support workers who were supervised by non-peer supervisors, how is it going? What's your experience? What's this like? How are you doing? How are you figuring it out? And what I discovered is that there was a huge amount of confusion and sometimes conflict that arose because the two people who were engaging in supervision had a different perspective, had different experiences, had a different life view. And that didn't get transparently talked about up front. There were assumptions on both sides that clouded the conversation and sometimes made it exceedingly difficult for success. So what I learned and what now makes perfect sense to me, and I hope to you today, is that the challenge for non-peer supervisors is that even with the best intentions, and I will tell you, peer support workers loved their supervisors. That wasn't the issue. But with the best intention, non-peer supervisors are trying to guide people in roles, peer support worker roles, that they've never been in themselves. It's not what they've ever done. Makes it interesting, right? So it's very possible and most likely that sharing one's personal recovery story is a different skill from a clinician who has been taught and has practiced maintaining professional distance, right? And it's very possible and very likely, and these are just examples, that empathy based on experience is very differently conveyed than empathy based on knowledge, right? I kind of call that dichotomy, been there, done that, versus read about it, saw it once. It's a very different experiential situation. So and something very important to say about it. I want to spend a few minutes using the chat box to get your feedback. So in the chat box, if you will, this is voluntary, so everybody doesn't have to do it, but indicate whether you're a supervisor, a peer support worker, you're a service user, family member, non-peer service provider, however you identify yourself. Put that in the chat box, and in that same chat box, please, a couple of words or sentences about what are some of the differences you've noticed between yourself and the person that you are in supervision with, whichever side of the equation you're on. If you're being supervised, what are some of the differences? If you're the supervisor, what have you noticed? You can just spend the next few minutes thinking about that and sharing. Couple more minutes, because I know, because my technical difficulties, we started later than we would like. Constance, I should stop at 2:15 or 11:15 your time? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So we have a very diverse audience, which I'm eternally grateful for. And someone has a great sense of humor. So let me just share a few of these. So someone with a sense of humor said they make more money. That's frequently true. Supervisors often do make more money. That's a difference. Several of you in the room are new to this experience, so you're here to learn. Peers are open-minded and venerable or vulnerable. I don't know which, but that is a difference. What else do we have here? A lot of peer support workers. Different upbringings, different cultures, difference in view of what boundaries look like. Yes, that's a frequent identified difference. I lead from the perspective of my lived experience. Yep. Openness to share their barriers or life experience in relation to failure and insights more freely than I would. Yep. Someone shares that the team feels comfortable because they understand I was once in their position, so that makes a difference. Okay. One difference I see is how we interpret a crisis, and we have varying perspectives on boundaries. Yes. Okay. Thank you for that. What I think you will notice in the chat box, and unfortunately I don't have time to go through all of it, is that because of the differences in perspective, you bring to supervision those differences. And of course, my darling slides won't change. Here we go. So in my research, I spent time looking at job postings for peer support workers across the country. And the things that jumped out at me were there were 3 common job duties requested in these job postings that are distinct from traditional professional. I don't mean professional, I mean licensed, because I believe peer support work as a profession. But there are three common job duties that were repeated over and over again. And the first is that peer support workers are being hired to provide hope and encouragement by serving as a role model of someone in recovery. The second difference was they were expected and are expected to provide that perspective to team members on the experience of mental illness and the journey of recovery. And the third was the expectation that peer support workers will use their recovery story as it relates to the peer support relationship. Now, those three job duties are not ones that typically show up in the resumes or the job duties of licensed professionals. That is not the expectation. It's a big difference. And anytime my PowerPoint would like to change, that would be greatly appreciated. Come on. If you talk to it sweetly, does anyone know? Does it do what it's supposed to do? Well, it's not going to, but you understand my point. The point being, peer support workers have a skill set and a perspective and life experiences that can be very different from their supervisor if the supervisor happens to not be a peer. And that creates role confusion at the very least. It's hard to help someone grow in their profession if you haven't yourself practiced those particular skills and honed those experiences and had experiences. One of the things that often gets overlooked with our, I'm going to say national, but also worldwide emphasis on education is that we learn from experience. Yes, it's good to learn from books. It's good to learn from teachers. Very valuable. But the bottom line is we are hardwired to learn with all our senses and our experiences. I always share this story. When I became a parent for the first time, all of the friends that I had in my support network that I had that didn't have children were useless to me. I desperately needed to speak to somebody who knew what to do with this thing they sent home, from the hospital with me. This little bundle, this little, this infant. And that's how I learned. I mean, there were great books out at the time. I read them. It wasn't the same. It just wasn't the same. And that's my point, if I could ever get my PowerPoints to do anything. Constance, do you have any ideas of why PowerPoints don't move? No. Okay.
I do not, although sometimes if I restart my computer, that's worked, but I don't know, Joanne. It seems they do have a mind of their own, it seems.
Okay. Well, bear with me, folks, and I apologize again. So what I'm trying to highlight is just for all of us to keep in mind that lived experience is different than academic learning. And lived experience-based interventions, right, which is what we peer support workers do, differ from academically trained interventions. And frequently, what the conversation becomes is concerns about dual relationships, right? That's a distinction that did not exist in the early self-help groups. Power differentials, right? Frequently academic trained professionals are clear that they're the experts and they have a huge amount of expertise. But they may not have experience, but they have the power over somebody. And that is not something that is a value embraced by peer support workers, correct? If you were to see my slides, which eventually they may cooperate, I put up for you to look at the peer support values, right? They've been around for a long time. You can find them certainly on the National Association of Peer Supporters website. And they're the foundation of what we do. But there are some distinctions. So for example, peer support is voluntary. Voluntary in the world of medical model mental health care is not quite the same. I'm saying that tongue in cheek, right? Peer support is mutual and reciprocal. That is a value that we hold dear, but it's also a distinction from those who are academically trained. So when you talk about reciprocity and partnership and walking beside someone, not ahead of someone, not behind someone, but walking beside someone, that's a concept that is different for people who are academically trained. Peer support is transparent. I'm just pulling from our values, some of the ones that are more distinct. Transparent is you are who you are. You have your story, you have your lived experience, you share it. Most academically trained folks have their stories trained out of them, right? Are reminded in their own supervision that it's not about you, it's about the person that you're working with. It's a different perspective. So what's the problem? What are the possibilities? What are the challenges that these different perspectives bring? I will tell you that what I've seen and what you may have experienced, and I hope we'll have a little bit of time for discussion despite these glitches, is that peers who are hired into systems that are already standing, all right, usually there are only one or two of you. You're joining a larger group of professionals who have had years of history of learning how to work together. So social workers and nurses and psychiatrists and psychologists, occupational therapists, family support workers, they finally, after many, many years, have learned how to dance together, and they speak a very similar language. As someone who's a peer support worker entering that world and being supervised by someone from that world, frequently the non-peer supervisor will expect the peer support worker to have those same values, those same understandings, and it's just not there. We worry about peer drift, right? We worry about co-optation, and it's frequently in that gray area of difference between peer support profession and another profession, where sometimes it's just easier to go along with the group. And I'm saying that out loud because I've heard peer support workers say it. You know, our view can be very different, and it can be very intimidating to be the one person to say, excuse me, I don't see it that way. And no, I don't want to be the medication police, et cetera, et cetera. when we talk about competencies in both peer support work or supervision, when you talk about mutuality and reciprocity, professionals get very concerned about boundaries. Boundaries, dual relationships, ethical issues, because it's a different perspective. And I'll share a story that I heard in a state that will remain nameless. And it had to do with these very issues. So a peer support worker was sharing that she had a home base. I'm going to say dual diagnosed, double trouble in recovery. There's all kinds of phraseology now for people who have both been diagnosed with a mental health condition and been diagnosed with a substance abuse problem. So the peer support worker was at her home meeting, AA meeting, it happened to be, she was the guest speaker for that month. And in the door walks two of the people that she was walking beside in her role at work as a peer support worker. Flustered her a little bit, but she did her speech, well received. The next day when she went to work and spoke to her non-peer supervisor and told her what happened, the non-peer supervisor's response is, well, you can't go to that meeting again. You have to find a new home meeting. Now that sounds pretty dramatic, does it not? But that's where some people are, and that's some of the confusion that results from these differences in perspective. So I'm going to bring us back full circle to the question of how do we learn? And I will say to you again, we learn from example, we learn from apprenticeship. It's how we learn almost everything. Professionals of all kinds have learned that way. And that's why the stratification within a certain discipline. That's why social workers supervise social workers and psychologists supervise psychologists. So back in 2007, when those guidance letters came out and it suggested that someone with a licensed mental health professional supervise a peer support worker, I just didn't get it because I thought, well, how is that going to work? And many of you in the room, and I'm sorry I can't see all of you, may have had that experience of how does that work? When I asked that question in my research, it's not surprising that the number one request from peer support workers across this country is they want to learn from someone more experienced in doing peer support work. Thus, my question, the question for everyone to think about and to talk about and to not lose sight of is, what are you role modeling? Role modeling behaviors is an important component of supervision. And it's an important component on both sides, if you will, because a peer support worker who is newly hired into a system that's trying to figure it out, and we are in transition, folks. We're going to be in transition probably for another 20 years. Hate to tell you that, but I think that's true. Both folks, the supervisor, the identified supervisor, and the peer support worker, are role modeling behaviors for one another. And for peer support workers, this is the gift you bring, because you have an opportunity to role model the values that are inherent in peer support. And that is a great gift for folks who have not thought about the work that they're doing. And remember, what is the work that we're doing together? The work we're doing is to stand beside someone who's perhaps diagnosed with a mental health challenge or a substance abuse challenge and say, I have some information and I have some knowledge that can perhaps help you. And I'm here to stand by your side to share that. In the rooms, right? Experience, strength, and hope. That's what we're sharing. As a peer support worker, as you role model your values, the gift you are giving to perhaps your non-peer supervisor is that perspective that recovery is possible, that everyone's life experience is unique, that there are ways that are not talked about in textbooks for people to understand themselves and their journey. That's a gift. That's a real gift that you're giving to a non-peer supervisor. And what I've understood from talking to people supervised by non-peer supervisors is that they also learn a tremendous amount, right? It's a two-way street. It's not always viewed that way. I will share with you, many of the people I interviewed were leaving the profession of peer support because they were so frustrated by their inability to get their supervisor to understand peer support. That happens. To believe in recovery, that happens. But there were a lot of non-peer supervisors out there who said, you know what? I'm not a peer support worker. I don't really understand what you do, but I have confidence that you do. And I have your back and I will support you and we can talk about it. And I'm very eager to learn from you. So that kind of conversation works wonders for both people in supervision to understand that learning is mutual and reciprocal. It's a real gift. And I'm very frustrated, I will share transparently with all of you, because one of my slides was really to have a greater discussion about what you've seen role modeled, either as a supervisor who doesn't happen to be a peer. What have you learned from the peers? And as a peer support worker, what have you learned from the supervisor? And again, I apologize. I don't know. Apparently the gremlin I have is recalcitrant, so I just have to go with it. Before I end though, I want to cover some important material. One of the things that peer support workers shared with me about their experience being supervised by non-peers is that if the supervisor's attitude was one of respect and positive non-judgmental communication, it allowed room for both of them to grow in harmony with each other. The other thing that was clear is role integration, the team understanding what peer support work is, service users understanding what peer support work is far from being finished. So a lot of supervision has to do with how do we get this message out? How do we get service users and other staff to understand what peer support is, its value, how it makes a difference? That's a huge part of supervision. The other piece, and I'm so excited that Chair has put on this conference, and I see some of the other presenters are talking about this. trauma-informed skill set on both sides, because we do understand that for many, many people, lived experience comes with trauma before, during, after. And to understand how that shows itself in our work, in our perspective is critical. And what I want to leave you on is two important points. Peer supervisors need the support of more experienced peer supervisors, and non-peer supervisors would be well served to encourage input from more experienced peers. And what I've seen across the country, and many of you may be in this situation, is a licensed mental health professional might have the title of supervisor, but so many of you and so many of them are so smart, they figured out right away that they were going to ask the most experienced peer support worker they knew to really be the supervisor of the other peer support workers. And that works very well. So to wind up, because I think I'm running out of time, what are the remedies about this difference in perspective? And I will implore you that first and foremost is to recognize that there are differences in worldviews. We all have this concept about reality, that there is a reality, and that reality is knowable. I will share with you, I have too many years of life on this planet to want to say how many, but I will share with you what I have learned is that all our realities are slightly different. We don't share the same realities. We could be in the same room, we could be looking at the same thing. I will guarantee you, you're all having a different experience of this presentation than the person next to you. And that's cool and that's fine, but you got to embrace that, if you will. So remedy number one is accepting and embracing that your perspectives are different and you have a lot to learn from one another. The other remedy is to expect and impart mutual learning. And one way to do that is to always be curious, to ask those questions. You know, I see it differently, but I'm really wanting to understand what your perspective is. Now, you may not like the perspective the other person has, but it's really important to support mutual learning. The third remedy for this kind of thing is please find yourself what we call a community of practice. Find yourself a network. If you're a peer support worker or if you're a non-peer supervisor, find those other people doing what you're doing and spend time with them. And it's you, if there's not a community of practice where you are, you can start one. You can be the person to say, you know, folks, let's get together on Thursday right after work at 5 o'clock and just let's talk. And that way you create this community of practice. It takes a life of its own. Natural leadership comes forward so that, you know, there's always one person who's good about, you know, reminding people, we're meeting Thursday at 5 o'clock, be there. Please do that for yourself. And network. Conferences such as this is a great place for networking. If someday maybe we'll be in person together so we can actually sit and share coffee and share stories. But even through the chat box, you know, you can connect with people. Somebody says something that resonates with you, you know, reach out. Say, you know, I loved what you said. Can we talk? Those are the remedies for bridging this difference that is wonderful, that can be exciting, but also can be frustrating and confusing. And so I thank you very much. I apologize for the glitches. I had such great slides. But hopefully Constance and Cher can grab them and put them up on their network for you. And I will answer any questions you want to put in the chat, if I can get the chat to even work. Ah, there we are. Ah, yes. Questions, please. I can be reached, by the way. Of course, it's on the last slide. At Forbes Wallace at AOL. If you want to have a discussion or you have a particular question that I'm not able to get to, certainly feel free. I'll put that in the chat box for you.
Thank you so much, Joanne. It was wonderful. And we have about a minute left. I wish we had more time.
I do as well. And I did go through this very quickly, but I trust that those of you in the audience understand the major point that I was making, that as you go about the world, please be conscious of what you're role modeling. And oh, I love these. There's a lot of comments. I'm not seeing questions, but there's great comments. So I hope you're all looking at the chat box because it's just delightful. And thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Constance, thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanne.
Okay.
That was really wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for being here. The next session is the Friendship Squad, from idea to manifestation, and that begins at 11:30. And I will stop recording now.